Welcome to Diagnosing Dx, the podcast giving diagnostics the platform it deserves. While therapeutics and devices often take centre stage, diagnostics is the engine driving precision medicine. I'm your host, David Philby, and each week we spotlight the innovators, breakthroughs, and real-world challenges shaping the future of DX. In this episode of Diagnosing DX, I'm joined by Mark Oldroyd, a commercialization strategist with over 30 years in healthcare, including leadership roles at Foundation Medicine, Tempus, and C2i Genomics. Mark has helped diagnostics and omics companies across the US, Europe, and Asia find the right path to market. We discuss the challenges of moving from science to a sustainable business, the hard truths of funding and reimbursement, and why sometimes the smartest move is to start small and scale where you can win. Mark, thank you for coming on the show this week. Hope you are well.
Sure, I'm well. How about you?
I'm very good, thank you. Very good. I've been excited to catch up. There's actually, it's been a little while since we spoke, isn't it? And it feels like everything in the current landscape is a bit of a moving target. It seems like there's updates all the time with regards to sort of regulations and stuff. But also, I've been pretty pleased with a bit of optimism in the market and some successful raising happening over the last couple of months. So, a lot to get into, but before we do that, if you could give us an introduction to you, your background, your career, and your sort of focus within the diagnostics and genomics space, that would be awesome.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on. First of all, as I shared with you, I'm new to this world, so hopefully this goes smoothly today. But 30 years in the industry and 20 years in startups and on the therapeutic side, so more drug development and launches. Formerly trained as an attorney, but focused in the healthcare space for all that time. And the last 10 years really focused in diagnostics, large data sets, evidence development, a lot of business development in pharmaceuticals, therapeutic and diagnostic development. Was fairly early on in Foundation Medicine, helped get their payer contracting rolling in the regional space with a lot of Blue Cross and other regional plans. And then was recruited over to Tempus quite early on in 2017 and helped with early pharma business development there, and then led the commercial channel group for a couple of years before COVID. During COVID, moved over in transition as a chief business officer at C2i Genomics, which was eventually acquired by Veracyte. And there got into a lot of global activity, a lot of work in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, a little bit in Africa and the Americas as well. And led that effort for a few years, and then was at Culmination Bio most recently as chief commercial officer for a few years, and left last summer to kind of hang my own shingle out. Started my own consulting practice, serving in board and voluntary advisory in about 2019, and throughout COVID was doing that, and so turned at it from a kind of side hustle thing into a full-time deal last summer, and have a number of clients around the world in the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. Really companies that are trying to commercialize in the US. Some are already here, some are trying to get here, and a variety of disease areas and asset types as well.
Wow. Okay, so a lot to unpack. Where do we start? So
not too much for discussion, but
what? Obviously, you're on the therapeutic drug development side for a long time. What initially drew you into the diagnostic side?
You know, it was interesting. I was in the therapeutics for that 20-year window, and had been at Endo Pharmaceuticals via a couple acquisitions of smaller organizations at the time. And in 2014, I believe it was, they got a new CEO and they started cutting people loose. And I think it was within a one-day window, about 80 of us in the market access department were let go. Including my group, which I had built for almost 5 years at that point. When I got there, they didn't really have a role for me, and so I raised some money from some of the marketing teams and developed my own team around kind of a hodgepodge of GPOs, big IDNs, a lot of federal VA and DoD contracting, and build that business inside of Endo to a little over 100 million a year in revenue. And but with the restructuring, we were all, out of work. They gave us a severance, and we all kind of said good luck. And as I was looking around and talking to recruiters, I ended up with an offer at Foundation Medicine after a handful of interviews to still focus in market access and build the payer space, as I mentioned. And met some great folks there, had a good time at Foundation. I think the teams we built were really solid. A lot of those people remain in the industry in various leadership roles around both large and small companies 10 years later. So I think it was a good experience for me. A handful of others that came from the therapeutic side, they're now heavily in diagnostics, large data, real world evidence, and that sort of asset.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you feel, because obviously you're now commercialization strategy is at the sort of forefront of the advisory and
Right.
consultancy gigs that
Yeah.
you do you feel that a lot of your style or approach to commercialization strategy is taken from originally from therapeutics, or is it now, is it just completely different and built on the last 10 years within diagnostics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the therapeutic space was interesting because it was so heavily regulated, right? We had
Right.
to deal with FDA and new drug applications, and through any kind of marketing activity or launch plans, it was highly regulated. The diagnostic space, when I first joined Foundation, we weren't yet in the process of, FDA approvals for a companion diagnostic, which at the time, made sense for the business strategy. I didn't totally um, either appreciate or agree with this with the FDA getting involved with diagnostics only because typically they're looking at safety type issues and so forth. And so it makes it a little harder to commercialize when there's a hurdle like that in a regulatory environment for a diagnostic test. If you think about, I'll call it lesser tests like, urine samples, urine tests, blood tests, and so on, strep tests, for example, none of those are, regulated testing type environments. But for whatever reason, in the omics space, we've made this big push over the last 10 years that everything's got to be, regulated and everything's got to be going through the FDA. And yet there's no safety issue in running a DNA test or running an RNA test on a specimen or a blood sample. Um, so that's been a little bit challenging, I think, for a lot of companies to both understand and then get through that process for some kind of commercialization. Um, my perspective on the commercial side is regardless of the asset, if you're strategically setting yourself up in a position that you can be reimbursed, because a lot of these founders are engineers, physicians, scientists, and so on that may or may not have, a lot of commercial background. And I find with my clients, that's often the case is they may have been involved with other products as entrepreneurs and scientists, but that's not their specialty, nor should it be. I mean, they're the ones creating, these cool technologies. So um, hopefully that's where my background and those like me can help get them through that intersection of, regulatory to an actual commercially operating entity.
Yeah, interesting. So you're ultimately the yin and the yang that allows them to be, you keep doing what you do
Yeah.
great.
Well, a little bit, right? Like you don't want them to come off the target of, here's what our asset does. Because my
Yeah.
presumption and when I meet with new clients or new companies is I'm going to assume your science is right because I'm not the scientist, right? So I'm going to assume your engineering, your platform, whatever it is in the asset, does what it says it does. And
Yeah.
what you say as a company, is your secret sauce, right? And if that works, like we think it does, then I can find a commercial pathway that would accommodate that. Sometimes it might be research only for a while. Sometimes it may be a combination of research and clinical use. Sometimes it may be a totally different commercial trajectory for things now like software as a medical device, for example. I've both worked in the past and currently with clients in that space, which is getting larger. as we get into, large language models and other AI type tools, in addition to traditional stats and probabilistic mathematics that are being applied to these data at large scale, you have a totally different picture around a platform than it used to be. And so those can become their own asset without a succinct or very specific LDT type diagnostic test, even though they could result in those or yield that as an output. Often the insights from the data themselves are a better uh, asset as far as revenue, and
Mm.
especially in the research side.
I was going to ask you if your approach to commercialization strategy and what good looks like, if it changes or has changed through the years. But I think a better question would probably be how often does
Hmm.
it have to change in terms of, I know there isn't sort of a one fits all for
Right.
early stage companies anyway, but do you find that, it could be every 6 months that even your set options of what you would advise are
Right.
having to be revamped and updated? Because obviously the LDT, FDA, I mean, that's an ongoing thing that we've
Yeah.
probably got a little bit of breathing room at the moment, but not forever. So
Hmm.
how often is your approach to strategic commercialization having to change and be updated?
That's a great question. I think if we really peel back what the technology is from the beginning, then the set the strategy doesn't need to adjust significantly during the process of that development. The
Mm,
biggest adjustments are based on timing of funding, timing of potential revenue coming in, which channels you would launch this particular asset or product in, vary depending on what they're trying to accomplish. Set traditional diagnostic tests, anyone can probably make a list that's in the industry, says, hey, we want to be in the big IDNs, the Kaisers, Intermountains, Banner, and so on in the world. We want to have, a research element, which is often misunderstood, and go into pharma and support pharma and get paid, the big bucks, which are there for certain applications, but often that's kind of a dead end path for a lot of these newer technologies because they see so many every week that to get a small company in front of them, number one, is a challenge. And even if you can get in front of them, often you're not the solution they need, because their research is booked out months and years in advance. And so to come in with something new, the soonest you're going to see, a result from that is maybe a year later, a year and a half on, where you've been built into a research design or protocol, study protocol, something like that. So how often does it change? I think I guess the short answer to that is that they have to remain quite flexible in the
mm,
process of learning where their asset fits in the market, especially if they enter a crowded space like oncology, for example, which has been crowded for many years. And I was on with a client yesterday, and we were talking about the example of Keras back in 2012-ish. I can't remember exactly when they launched, but around that period when they were out, Foundation was quite new, if not just about to launch at that time, and that was it. There wasn't molecular diagnostics, there was not reimbursement, there was not a path to any of that, and
mm,
so if you look at now, MRD has gone through that process the last 5 years. Screening has gone through that process the last 5 to 7 years, in cancer only. And now you're
mm,
starting to see tests. I met with a potential client in Europe this morning that's focused on the neurological space, for example. And each of these windows of disease are starting to get more activity. And so the process to get to a launch is similar in every case. The challenge again is, based on the disease, how many physicians are used to using or ordering that type of tool, right?
mm.
And if it's a new disease area like neurology, that may not be used to it. And so you've got a hurdle on just adoption and acceptance to create any kind of demand curve to begin with,
Right.
let alone all the reimbursement elements that, get tied to the back end of that transaction.
Mm, yeah, interesting. So 2025,
Mhm.
where does the market lay at the moment? Sounds like you're talking to a really nice variety of companies and modalities.
Yep.
Um, how do things lay at the moment, and what have sort of been the biggest shifts that you've seen in the last couple of years? How should companies be setting themselves up at the moment for commercialization? At Alevra Consulting, we focus on DX only, supporting early stage and growth companies achieve their milestones by solving their biggest talent challenges. Have you ever suffered from working with a talent partner who was either life sciences or med tech and dabbling in diagnostics? Or no more? Work with a diagnostics specialist talent partner.
Sure. Well, I mean, if we stay just focused on diagnostics for a minute, because obviously not all my clients sit in that bucket, but the ones that do are facing similar hurdles to what I just described. But in addition, specifically this year, for those that I've tried to help point the right direction in terms of funding, for example, and you mentioned that a little bit earlier on, it's quite difficult, even though there have been some additional rounds being released in quite large scale for certain companies. But in general, if you look at the masses of new startups, you know, a lot of them are not getting funded right now. And so the challenge, I think, at least that I've found with a number of the VCs that I've been interacting with, is they're also raising new rounds in many cases. And so you have the limited partners, you know, upstream from them being a little stingy, creating terms that they don't like, and therefore, obviously downstream, they don't take that money. And then the result is they're really propping up existing organizations, not bringing in new
Yeah.
opportunities. So that's the biggest hurdle, is because the revenue is going to take longer than most founders think. You know, I've met with a few founders that are, and they should be this, you know, every day it's the big vision and we're going to make it. And, you know, you have to do that if you're the founder. I'm a little more on the realistic side of things to, you know, show that not every shiny corner has a shiny underbelly in the market, and that you may be facing some challenges you're just not aware of yet. Not to be negative, but just to be realistic about, you know, the timing to revenue. I've had a couple companies ask, you know, well, could we get, you know, a pharma deal in the next couple months? And I'm like, we'll be lucky to have them listen to your deck in the next couple months, let alone, you know, put some money on the table. So I think there's a gap between, you know, the high science being what it is and the commercial activities related to those being completely different, you know, in these folks' minds, because they hear of Tempus and they hear of Foundation and, you know, with all these various exits for IPOs and others like them, and they're like, we can be that, you know. And there are lots of reasons why they can't be that. You know, at Tempus, it's, you know, Eric was a billionaire when he started, so it wasn't hard to do any project that we wanted to get done there.
Yeah.
Being essentially self-funded for a long time at the beginning. And at Foundation, they had a lot of good, you know, investors at the time wanted to come back the Keras model that was coming out recently before. So, you know, it's a different environment now. If you look at even just cancer, right, you're trying to get this tiny sliver of an already shrinking pie of research dollars, development dollars, and so forth. And on the clinical side, you know, it's confusing the physician. Any clinician now, if you're a mid to late stage cancer patient, has, you know, probably a dozen or more companies in their office every day trying to have them write some test or another, whether it's MRD or screening or what have you, monitoring, you know, drug response testing, vRNA, you know, there are all kinds of options. And so the biggest challenge isn't necessarily, you know, overcoming all that noise, although that is one that has to be overcome. The bigger challenge is, where do you want to launch your asset? Do you want to be in cancer? You know, from a founder perspective, if you have the science that works in a cancer cell, as a non-scientist, I might nudge you and say, you know, maybe you want to test it on an autoimmune disease and see what you got, because autoimmune disease is very underserved. The patients are often miserable, but live fairly normal lifespans. So you're in a market that isn't diminishing as you go, like oncology. And that's not to say I think we shouldn't fix cancer. We absolutely should fix it. And we have all the companies sitting out there that are working on it right now. But to be a new company, you know, to say you're going to be the one that solves this, or that probably isn't likely. Again, not to diminish anyone's vision, but commercially speaking, the science may be phenomenal, but if you don't have a transaction, you're still doing a project in the garage. You're not really running a business at that point.
How often or how common is it for you to speak to a scientific founder, somebody maybe an academic, who struggles to get to grips with your, as you just plainly put it, your response to, their belief, and I mean, maybe they're in love with their own science, right?
Sure. Yep.
Is that common that you're being put in touch with these types of founders who, they believe they're about to change the world, and or is it a balance? Is there, you know, great scientific founders out there that are actually really humble, and just, they're like, we've got this science, but we don't know the market opportunity, and that's why we want to hear what you've got to say.
That's a good question as well. I think there's a mix, obviously different personalities go into every field. And so in some cases, they're the latter
Yeah.
that you described. They've accomplished a ton of things, highly published, have a technology that makes sense in the market, but just really don't know how to move it through those channels and get an actual transaction processed.
Right.
And then you have others that no matter how much you describe, the process there that's ahead of them, they're like, no, it'll be, we'll be like this company or that company or the other. And I kind of smile and nod and say, okay. And, typically those discussions don't go much further than that because I don't want to ruin anyone's dream or vision. But at the same time, I can't, for my own purposes, don't want to take on clients that I can see there's not really a good path for them commercially, because then I wouldn't be doing them any, favors and taking them on as a client. And I think the biggest challenge is if you come from a very rigorous technical training background, science, engineering, medicine, what have you, your mind is highly focused and has to be to learn those fields. And and they should be, right? Those are the specialists we have in society that's we want them there. The problem with that combined with business is that business is big blocks, right? And for me, I'm not a specialist. I'm a generalist, obviously, admittedly so, both here and otherwise. I think in big blocks. And so the industry for me is in big chunks. It's, GPOs and federal contracting and trade relations, and it's payer, whether private, public, cash, what have you, and it's clinical channels and it's research driven, right? And I can look at an asset and move those around through those various blocks and find the places that a transaction is more likely to occur after doing this 30 years than it's less likely to occur. And so
Mm.
those are the types of discussions I have with most founders, regardless of their kind of personality traits and their position on their asset is, hey, it's likely or not, in this channel, you will or won't have success. And usually they, because of how they're trained, will at least be thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
And we end up in some pretty good discussions. And that's frequent, I would say. I mean, I meet with, at this point, to kind of a year in full time to this, 1 to 2 new companies a week, via referral primarily.
Yeah.
So yeah, and
Given,
there's amazing development and technology, by the way, in these companies without disclosing anything I shouldn't. I know what a lot of these companies are working on is phenomenal, and regardless of how it ends up commercialized and whether I'm helping or not, we have some great things coming to service the patient and multiple diseases in the next 2 to 3 years.
yeah, awesome. Are you often having initial conversations with companies that are already have a commercialization strategy, and they're maybe a couple of years into it, or maybe not commercialized, but certainly they were going a certain path,
Sure.
and they're at that point where we think we need to rethink this.
Yeah. Get stuck, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, and if when you have them conversations, what are the typical mistakes that you're seeing companies have made when they've tried to do something and now they're having to pull it back?
Sure. Yeah. I had an example today with a new client, and what you're describing is common. Often, what happens is if you can get any traction at all in the earlier stages, you take it, right? You want an
Mm.
early partner, you want an early win. You may want a contract with a bigger entity, all correct things to do strategically. The biggest thing I think people miss is that the reimbursement function is what pays the bills, not the demand, right? So if you have, I'm making it up, but you got 50 reps out banging doors at hospitals and clinics, and you create a big demand curve, that looks nice. Everyone's, cheering and happy. But at the end of the day, if no one's set up to pay for that, then you still don't really have a business. You have interest, from a clinical perspective, for example. Um, and so it's often backward. This happened with therapeutics too. Often when I was hired on the market access side, they already had either launched or gotten ready to launch and really didn't have a market access function in these smaller companies until I got there or the team I built, was wholly focused on that. And as a result, we were always chasing the reimbursement. And so I usually advise new clients, listen, if we're going to tackle that as part of what I'm helping with, we want to focus on the payer. Um, and I say that quite generally, as I said earlier, from cash all the way to, Medicare and public and private payers and so on. Uh, Large self-funded employers, you've got all kinds of payer options.
Mm.
And that's often where, as we said a minute ago about these technical folks, they don't really have that background. They haven't had to do those types of agreements. They haven't had to structure, how they arrange their reimbursement for their particular asset in a specific way for all these different channels. And that's difficult, unless you've done it for a long time. So I think that's the biggest kind of black box to most founders is, how do I get paid? They know they want to get paid or they wouldn't have launched a company. They would
Yeah.
have just stayed at the bench and kept doing research and publish and.
Mm.
But anytime they're making that next move to say, hey, I think this is a business, the thing that seems to be missing the most often isn't an acknowledgement that they do need reimbursement. It's we need reimbursement, and then it's like a cliff. And now I have no idea how to go forward, right? Other than, dinner parties and people telling them you should do this, you should do that, you should whatever. And often people get, in the weeds and on down a path that is not necessarily going to help them. And that's often where we start is maybe they have a little revenue even, or, if they have a commercial engine already with personnel and operating, there isn't as much I need to do because they're probably just being impatient with time to
Mm.
market or time to reimbursement. It's really when they don't have anybody there yet, other than the founding team or maybe a handful of advisors, me included, that would push them to that next level, which is where most of these clients sit for me. I'm not opposed to working with bigger companies. I think there's some business there as well and interest in having that expertise, but in general, they're already at a point to hire full-time folks. It's just a different model than what I built.
Do you find the same because you mentioned earlier that you're talking to European companies trying to come to the US? Is that a big uh, point of difference in terms of what they're used to in the EU, the
Right.
reimbursement side, where they're
Yep.
coming to the US, they see this huge market opportunity based on top line
Right.
numbers, and then
Yeah.
they go, is that one of the first things that they all
Often,
miss? Yeah.
yeah. Often it's if you've seen a U.S. payer, as everyone has heard over the years in the industry, if you've seen one U.S. payer, you've seen one because they're all completely unique in how they handle things. There are enough similarities in the coding systems and how the billing logistics works that you can eventually get paid. But in terms of policy creation, how they judge and evaluate health economic data, and so on, are all quite unique. And so um, that is to your question the biggest hurdle I think coming from an environment with GDPR requirements on data or IVD or IVDR previously requirements on just the operating function in EEA. They use economic environment is a challenge, and so not to mention you know although it's the EU, there's still unique entities. So The
Yeah.
big difference between the EU and the US is, yes, the states all have Medicaid programs for, indigent care and those that are without work and so on, and we need those as backups, obviously. Um, but in the EU, those countries still run separate operations primarily for most of the healthcare system.
Yeah.
Germany is not like France, and those aren't like Denmark or Italy. And so, working within a lot of those countries for the last 5 or 6 years personally, you start to see those differences and get a little more familiar and comfortable with how do I launch? Because I have a few clients that want to go the other way. Like they want to go, they're in the U.S., they're doing okay, they feel comfortable, but maybe they want to expand. They want to look at Asia. They want to look at, the EU markets. So I have a couple clients where, we're looking at business in India and Japan and Singapore, for example, or China and companies from Asia trying to come to the US or Europe. So it really is a global flow of, these assets working both back and forth across different markets. I find that fascinating personally because it's more of a challenge for me, and that's why I enjoy the international element of this. But yeah, the EU coming here is one example. There are others, but that's pretty common. And even if they may have revenue in the EU for a variety of markets. And then, as you said, the kind of starry-eyed syndrome of, well, the U.S. is this massive healthcare market. We should be there. Um, but the assessment of the market is difficult, and that's where I have stepped in a couple cases and really dug into, the detail of what they want to enter, whether it's cancer or another disease, and how they would go about, making that transition without a U.S. presence, without a U.S. corporation or entity. Now, often they'll form that as they go,
Hmm.
uh, but some of them don't have that yet. There's literally no presence, and so their biggest hurdle is noise. If you're not in a crowded disease, if you don't have a commercial operation, really, it's a little difficult to get new traction here.
Do you see that as a global trend? Do you see the US, which has traditionally been seen as the biggest market opportunity objectively,
Yeah.
do you see the US for European and Middle East, Far East companies? Do you see the US look less enticing at the moment because of all the, the geopolitical macro
Mess.
challenges that
Yeah.
was yeah, yeah, mess,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the word. The mess we have.
That's not a
um
scientific term, but it's a mess. Yeah.
do you see it as a less attractive option at the moment? And the same question, sort of vice versa, is because there's stuff that's going around at the moment in terms of the EU trying to attract more US
Mhm.
companies early to say, why don't you come here and develop the
Sure.
test kit and bring
Yeah.
some of your scientists and we'll give you some funding or grants maybe, right?
Right.
So do you see that sort of balance is shifting, and or is it something that's maybe just, yeah, there's a bit of noise, but not really. It's still,
I think it's a mixed bag on some of that. I think uh, the general opportunity in the EU is still, a good place to conduct business, especially when you're small. So, for example, if you're a startup and kind of this one of as the VCs say, a 0 to 1 entity, right? No revenue yet, need to raise cash. It's still more of a dream,
hmm,
with some caged ideas conceptually around, okay, here's how we would go to market, here's where it fits, here's how much money we'll need, we're creating a budget, a plan, and so on. Um, the EU, as just an anecdotal exercise, if you were a small company like that based in the US and want to enter the US versus you take your asset and you go to major markets, call it France, Germany, and maybe the Nordics all in one or something, right, in that region. The UK would be a good market, right? And if you test it there and you have success there, now you have revenue to operate. And this is how we built C2i originally, is we were operating a lot in the EU with early revenues coming from there before we really made big moves in the US for that
hmm,
purpose. Because my position on it strategically was, well, if we can get a big lab partner in France and they're operating in multiple countries in the EU, And we have a big partnership in Asia, which we ended up having more than one, but a minimum of one. Now you have revenue coming in before you go plunk yourself in the middle of a very dynamic and difficult market in the US that's more crowded typically and more challenging to operate without a very, very heavy commercial presence.
Mm.
Uh, because the science will only carry you so far. I have this discussion frequently on the topic of it doesn't matter if you're the best science. It matters if you have the most noise and enough data to get paid. So even if, you and I have a company and it's the best science on earth and, pick your technology, RNA, based technology of some sort, which is very popular right now. It doesn't matter if you're the best one. It matters if you're early enough with enough noise in the market and enough data to support what your technology says it does to be reimbursed, right? That's where the value is. And so a lot of companies, I think, fall short in looking that far forward to say, well, we want to have this big exit and, our technology is amazing. And like, it will be if you can show it makes money, then barring a therapeutic compound of some sort that, Pfizer or somebody wants to buy and finish the development and launch it for $1 billion, most diagnostics aren't in that spot. They're just not. The test is the test. And so it either makes money or it doesn't. If it doesn't make money, then your business is going to be slow. It's going to be small. And in my view, if you're going to be small, why not go to places that you don't have much competition?
Mm.
Even if your market is smaller overall, I'd rather have, 60% of a small market than 0.006% of a major one, because in the end, I'm going to have more revenue to support the business. And I think that's often it's something that's missed in, how founders view their technology going to market.
Does that make your role easier or harder to assess the potential of
Yeah.
a company, right? Because I think the assumption would be that, let's say you're the first commercial person they've spoke
Mhm.
to. It's their,
Right.
it's like they're coming out of a hive, and they're
Yeah.
like,
Right.
we need to, like, for the first time, we need to think
Sure.
about commercial strategy.
Yeah.
So I think my assumption would be that that conversation you're trying to assess, yeah, the science and the potential market,
Mhm.
but actually it's more than that. It's how do you assess if that company is actually going to be able to make money?
Mhm.
Um, that's really interesting. Is it? Does that make your role harder or easier?
I wouldn't say harder or easier as much as more or less challenging in terms of where their asset fits within those blocks I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
When you're seeing past the kind of minutia of the various steps you have to take to get to some transaction, I usually look at the asset, a test, a drug, a platform, a set of data, whatever it is, and think through it at the back end. What is the transaction, right? Where does that sit in the whole ecosystem? And then work backward from that transaction to say, okay, here's what you have now. Here's what you're going to need. Here are the studies you should do. Here are the health economics data you need. All of the steps that would be required to get to that transaction.
Mm.
If it's, a different market than the US, obviously the ones I've worked in, I'm more familiar with than the ones that I haven't. Um, and the Middle East is, a little lighter for me, but I have done some work there, and they're expanding a ton right now. So they're both in terms of investment and clinical services. And so it's a market where I have one of my clients that does a lot actually with the Middle East right now. And so we're doing, if I were to put, bar charts of markets, it may be the US is the most massive market. But if they're not spending on this type of asset, this service or product, whatever it is, and the Middle East is, even though it's, a sliver of the market, if they can get in and get their big chunk of market share earlier rather than later, their business is in a much better position. I
Mm.
think it's often in founders' minds, I have to be the best, I have to be the biggest, I will and want to be the biggest, right? And I think when you're small, you got to be okay with being small. And that
Mm-hmm.
means being more adaptive, and it means being reliant on larger partners, maybe markets that you weren't thinking about, but that would readily accept the services you have because they're underserved anyway. If you think about the way large companies build in the US, whether it's Tempus Foundation in diagnostics or, therapeutics that we're all familiar with, their first thing wasn't to go outside the US. They captured their big market share in the US and then later went out. And so with C2i, when MRD was new, I told the founders, I said, we'd be better off taking all the markets they're not coming after with Natera or others that were in that space at the time. And that's how we built that business initially, and why I think it had success and eventually, was acquired by Veracyte. Not the hugest exit in the world, certainly, but for a couple-year-old company, I think it was nicely done, and the founders and the whole team, both in Israel and around the world, did an amazing job there. So it's only an N of one in terms of success point, but I've spoken with a handful of the folks that we contracted with 5 years ago that are still operating using this technology in these foreign markets at large scale. And so guess what? Veracyte benefits, the acquirer
Yeah.
benefits. So where if we had only tried to do the elements in the U.S., I think it would have been not as profitable for one, and it would have been difficult. Even though we had teams in the U.S. doing those, and they did a good job as well. It's just with these startups being so small and underfunded in most cases, revenue may come faster in smaller markets than a big VC round, for example, right?
Mm.
Because of transactional, ability for a specific type of asset, especially if it's a test that can be partnered in an existing lab somewhere in a European country or an Asian country or wherever. You have opportunities then to expand that you're not going to get here.
Yeah, fair. When you meet those founders,
Yeah.
what do you typically see in terms of the ones that tend to go on and make it? And that I'm not necessarily, it might be personality traits, it might be, but it doesn't have to be. It could also be in terms of like, is there certain things that the founders that are setting themselves up well even before they've spoke to someone like yourself, that they've got good research in certain places, a good idea of how they're going to, what are you typically seeing in the companies and founders that you're like, I think this is a good one? And it's obviously, because you mentioned earlier, it's not the science always. There is obviously always going to be a scientific element, but
Yeah.
what are you seeing outside of that?
I think the founders that have had more experience in the market, so ones that aren't coming straight out of academia, for example,
Yeah.
maybe they've been in the industry at some point in time before or after their training, and that gives them enough exposure that they at least can take some of the blinders off as they're going into the business elements of the proposition of the company, right?
Yeah.
And so as they're setting it up, they then would have a little bit more strategic, view. But it's difficult. And again, I'm one person, so this is, 2 cents, whatever it's worth. But it's difficult with the if you haven't done this for 30 years in my case, or 20 or however long, it's difficult to understand the nuance of how you want to launch a very specific scientific asset, what it does, how it does it, right? And as I said earlier, it could be the very coolest, most novel modern technology on the planet. But if there isn't a very clear vision to the transactional elements, the cost elements in terms of overall cost to the healthcare system, the health economics of it are often ignored till much too late in the process of a launch. And without those, the reimbursement is likely to fail. May not and fail entirely, meaning the business will still run, but it won't be maximized at its highest level of potential income or revenue rather, because you missed, steps 4, 5, and 6 that would have given you access to a whole bunch of other opportunities that they just didn't know anything about. And so I think that's really the founders to your question. It's really the founders that have touched the industry at some level at some point, whether it was during training or after. And some are just wired. You know, you mentioned personality traits. Some people are entrepreneurial, some people aren't.
Yeah.
Um, and if you combine entrepreneurial with highly technical, usually that's a founder that has an open mind and wants to find, you know, the paths that we're talking about. Often they're, you know, end up being good partners or clients of mine because we can speak the same language and they want to learn. The same as I want to learn their technology. They want to learn, you know, the industry and how it's operating and where the sinkholes you want to avoid. So it works out. Others, you know, it could be a challenge because they're so focused on the science or the engineering or what have you. It's really hard to get them to, you know, pick their head up and see, you know, you're heading into all these challenging spaces unnecessarily in some cases.
How easy is it for those founders to assess market potential? Let's say, especially if they're in development, in the science,
Sure.
early stage, where a company could just be 5 to 10 scientists,
Yep, for
and
sure.
product
Or
guys.
less.
How easy is it for them at that point to be, lifting their heads up and looking at market potential? How do they even do that?
I mean, you know, you have everything from, you know, call your Bain rep or McKinsey or whomever, and you know, many do that and burn through a lot of capital, you know, in short order to get a big, you know, market assessment done. People like me in the industry, you know, are pretty resourceful, are able to do something similar, obviously for much less. A variety of reports, either purchased or, you know, free to everybody, you know, that you can put together a pretty fair market assessment if you're willing to take the time to do the research on it.
Mm.
You know, now everybody's, you know, AI this or AI that or GPT or I'm like, well, we know that those error rates are often high, so I don't know if I trust that alone as my, you know, market tools, but there are enough things, you know, you can pull together a fairly good market analysis, both in terms of total market as well as where the specific asset might fit. Often, I found the most of the time, the error, if there's an error in doing that process internally with the client, is that their view of what type of market share will be available to them is almost always overstated by some factor, and that's the first, you know, I'll say hard discussion is, you know, you're not going to get X amount of market share anytime soon
Mm.
and the reasons why, right? And because I'm not negative by nature, but I'm realistic. And so if you're telling me, yeah, we're gonna have in, you know, in 18 months, we're gonna have like 26% market share, I'm like, no. And not no just for a no sake, but no because. And then walk them through all of their competitors, how they've done it, where they're getting paid, where this current company or asset isn't,
Mm.
and help them get a broader view of, you know, here's where you're sitting in reality in terms of where your asset is compared to the market. And and a lot of it is based on things we've talked about today, you know, noise level, commercial experience, commercial capability, whether you're partnering, whether you're doing your own, you know, each of those has their own pros and cons, certainly. Um, and expenses and burn rates and so on associated with it. So uh, you know, these 0 to 1 or 1 to 2 type companies are in a really, really tough spot. It's just the reality of the business they've chosen to enter. And so hopefully, you know, what I've been finding is hopefully I can offer some help. And typically that's, you know, my first question is, well, how can I help if I can help? And then we kind of go from there. So, and sometimes I can't help, you know, they're so early on that it's going to take them a handful of years to have enough evidence to even approach a payer or even have enough clinical utility evidence to go talk to a physician about ordering something.
Mm.
And as a result, you know, it's maybe the wrong time to. We could set strategy elements around it, but as you said towards the beginning, you know, those may shift in the time they build their case studies and evidence for the asset.
Yeah. So there is resources there, and it's about utilizing them. You want to be utilizing them early because you need to know where you're going, but at the same time, you have to keep it developing your commercialization strategy because it could change, and also your data
Right.
and what you know as a company could change. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so objectively, Mark, to sort of wrap things up,
Mhm.
where we are in 2025, what's your outlook on the diagnostics and omics market for the future, and where sort of VCs really looking at the moment and what's exciting to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in most of my discussions, the feedback has been um, pretty broad. It's mixed, but it's pretty broad. Some people are still highly focused on regulatory-based diagnostics and therapeutics. Obviously, there are, dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of opportunities for those types of investments if that's what they really like. I've noticed a trend a little bit this year in discussions, primarily around foundational platform-based assets, so not necessarily resulting in a final tool of some sort, a specific clinical test, for example, but rather the platform itself for the sake of analyzing and getting insights out of the various data elements that they can compute from the platform. And so um, I would say going forward from, for the end of the year and into next year, the biggest um, growth is probably going to be in whether it's AI based or not, platform driven technologies that are maybe not unique to a very specific disease focused solution, even though those are certainly growing as well.
Yeah.
There are a lot of both investment and scientific minds that are thinking broader than that. And as a result, I think you're going to have more of these types of software as a medical device or even software as a service in some cases that is embedded, inside a particular health system, for example, conducting activities in the background that are both maximizing and utilizing technology that helps the patient journey along, not only in terms of workflow, but even in terms of the therapeutics and diagnostics that they receive. And so I think those are the types of companies that will see more and more support going forward. That's both EU based and US based VCs that I've heard that from in kind of mixed discussions. And I think that'll be an interesting growth area the next year or two because it allows broad diversity around the downstream outputs. In other words, if I have enough insights from, your company has a platform that does that type of thing, and I can put enough data elements in there, I can get enough insights out and then take those insights and have a very directionally focused uh, uh, work effort around uh, technology that would yield a diagnostic at the end. But it isn't the focus of your company, right, in that scenario. And so you've got this insertion point of these platforms that have a few clients that are in that space, and they're growing quickly, and they're being funded actually, I would say, at a quicker level than most of the technologies in diagnostics alone.
Mhm.
And therapeutics, I haven't focused on as much recently, but because that's more of a development, a 5 to 8 year window, and then you're really dealing with pharma to see who's going to pick up those technologies and launch them at scale. And diagnostics, that's a little harder. It's starting to happen. The roll-ups, Tempus's acquisitions of a handful of companies this year and in the past few years, and others that are looking to merge or acquire. It's a pretty active market right now for that,
Yeah.
and which is a driver too for newer companies like, well, if so and so would buy us, we'd have an exit in 2 years. Like, I mean, you could, but I don't think that's what you'll see. But good luck, and if I can help, I'll help. So.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's kind of where I see some things going is a broader application of these tools, whether AI based or not, that are embedded in these platforms.
Yeah, super interesting. We've had someone on recently they have a proteomics platform,
Yeah.
um, which has a really It seems super interesting, to be honest.
Yeah, it's very, I have a few, not clients, but a few colleagues and friends in that space, and it's growing, very, very quickly growing area.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much for your perspective and your insights. Really interesting to hear how you're seeing it, and an unfiltered version of this is
Sure.
this is how the market lies, and this is the mistakes people are making, but this is also the opportunities
Right.
that early stage founders should be taking as well.
Yeah.
Just super interesting to get your perspective on everything. It wasn't just commercial; it was so much broader than that.
Well, thank you, David. Like I said, I'm new to this whole podcast thing, so hopefully this was useful. But I appreciate you having me on, and good luck as you continue to develop the program. I know you've had a lot of great folks on, so I've been honored to participate. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.